Waiters, waitresses, what is the worst first date you've witnessed? Couple years ago, I was tending bar at a high-end steak joint. A pretty brunette walked in and sat down at the bar. After fixing her a cocktail, I asked if she'd like to see a dinner menu. She explained that she was waiting for a date. A few moments later, the guy arrived. He was carrying a large bag, which he carefully set down next to him. It was immediately obvious this date was their first. Their conversation was lurching from forced to downright painful when he reached into the bag and pulled out an album containing, his Pokemon card collection. He set the book on the bar and thumbed through each page, thoroughly and lovingly describing every card, attempting to educate his date in the ways of Japanese pocket monsters. I'll be fair to the guy, dude was passionate. She feigned an emergency and called her friend to pick her up. He stayed and ate a plain hamburger at the bar. Edit. Both of these people were in their mid-30s. This isn't as bad as some of the others, but the guy and girl arrived separately and it seemed like they were meeting for the first time at the restaurant. They sat down, then the girl excused herself and went to the bathroom. The guy ordered drinks for them both while she was gone then. After like 30 minutes, ordered 2 meals. It was so obvious she wasn't coming back, but he kept calling her and eventually just left all the food and drink untouched and paid the bill. Bartended for a decade. For a while I was at a medium-range Italian restaurant. More than once I saw a first date go awry because one of the two drank too much. Most memorable was a woman who started downing rum punches. They were at a table so I couldn't see them, and I guess the waiter had forgotten his red light, yellow light training. I don't know if they still do that. After the 6th one I asked if these were all going to the same person and he said yes. I was like, oh shit. Sure enough, girl ended up puking all over my bathroom and locking herself in. When we got the door open she was passed out and there was puke everywhere, including all over her. No cab would touch her, so the guy ended up taking her home. He came in a week later and said they were going on another date. I was skeptical. They've been married for about 15 years and are absurdly happy. She avoids rum punches. Oh man. Thanks for asking this one. I've got a great one. Happened at my former restaurant. Reservation for 6 o'clock. Young guy comes in a few minutes early. Tells me he's kind of nervous because it's a first date and he hasn't had many before. Blah blah blah. Kind of sweet really. Anyways, girl arrives about half an hour late and proceeds to get very drunk. About midway through the meal, she answers her phone, takes the call, and starts talking about her date. In front of her date. Saying stuff like, well, he's not usually my type. I don't exactly like him. But I felt like why not? Right in front of him. Young man looks so discouraged. Walks up to me. Pays his bill. And leaves. He's a really nice guy. He's come to the place I work at now a few times. He reached for his water and punched it directly into her lap. There was this young guy eating dinner with his mom. I noticed they seemed weirdly uncomfortable and distant but didn't think much of it. Turns out the lady was not his mom. He had met her on a dating site and had been very clearly catfished. The lady was at least a good 20 years older than him. When she left the restaurant he stayed behind and told me about what happened, then asked me out. I politely declined but agreed with him that that was a really weird situation. Witnessed a CPL on their first date having a few drinks. Started making out by the 3rd. Dude cried by the 4th. Started sucking on her finger. Cried again. Abruptly ran out of the bar and down the street. She paid. Came back 2 weeks later. I pretended not to recognize him to be nice. And he brought it up. I think you served me on a date 2 weeks ago. I don't know man, I serve a lot of people. Yeah, it was you. Remember? I cried and ran away. Bruh. I'm not service staff but I often eat drink alone and people watch. And first dates are almost always painfully obvious. Worst one I ever saw. 2 people who were probably perfect for each other. They were both completely self-absorbed. How completely? They both started stories and kept telling them at the same time. They weren't even listening. Just talking at each other. I was enraptured by the sheer insanity of it. I didn't eat for like 45 minutes as they both just yapped away. Barely stopping. I was hanging out at Starbucks and witnessed a horrible date. She was Japanese and he started off by showing her his shirt with sumo wrestlers on it. Then would ask questions like, "What's your favorite sushi? Do you only speak Japanese? How do you say toilet in Japanese? They have sumo in Japan, right? Did you see my shirt?" It was so amazingly awkward I bought another cup of coffee to listen to the entire thing. Couple in their mid-20s comes in. I wasn't serving them, however. I was serving the table next to them. About halfway through their meal I notice them holding hands over the table. Cute. Then, the guy lifts her hand to his lips and kisses the back of it. A bit of an outdated gesture. But still cute, I guess. The woman seems slightly confused but goes along with it. A little while later I see the guy do it again. Okay. Dude. Then again. Woman is confused and looks a little uncomfortable. They are no longer holding hands. I go to serve my table and see the dude full on making out with her hand. Tongue and all. Woman looks extremely embarrassed and uncomfortable. Looking everywhere but at her date. I go over and casually ask if they need anything. And the dude stops. Woman yanks her hand back. She left pretty soon after. I once saw a guy try and impress his date by pretending to know about wine. He then proceeded to pronounce every single wrong one. I don't even know how I would phonetically write out his butchering of Chablis and Sauvignon Blanc. Date looked at him like he'd just taken a sheet on the table. I'm a bartender at Popular Burger and Wine Bar. I had an older gentleman, about 60 years old, come in on a Wednesday evening and order a bottle of wine and 2 glasses as he's waiting for someone to show. This other older woman shows up a short while later and both of them hit it off. They sat themselves right behind my pose, so basically anytime I had to ring something and I had a front row seat to their date. Both of them crush 3 bottles of wine and sit there for about 4 hours talking away. Around the 4th hour of them sitting they both started making out randomly and will not stop. They started sucking faces with an uncomfortable intensity. Somewhat terrifying all my bar guests and myself. At one point the older fella leaves for the bathroom and his date proceeds to let me know it's their first time meeting. Not entirely the worst first date for them I suppose, but definitely was for me and the other customers. I have no idea if they were on a date or been married for too long, but this. We had our flight cancelled due to a snowstorm on Christmas Eve. The only place open for dinner was an Indian restaurant. There were a few customers in there. It was an interesting looking bunch. Sort of what you'd expect eating out on Christmas Eve. This one couple though looked to be in their 40s. A guy and a woman. She never said a word and looked like she was in a trance. The guy though kept talking at her in this slow monotone. And another thing I hate about you, and proceeded to critique her while she continued to stare into space. This probably doesn't compare to some of these freak show stories. But I'll tell it anyways. I worked for IHOP for a very long 3 months. Most of my experiences were decent. On one occasion, one of my acquaintances came in with a date. We had been friends as kids and still sometimes chatted amicably. At this time, I had a stutter that would happen if I spoke too quickly, was stressed, or just trying to speak hard words. I went up to their table, said hi to my friend and her date, and instantly flubbed the greeting with a stutter. Honestly, my stutter has never bothered me. Never felt like a bad thing until that moment. Her date looked at me, did that little condescending laugh that we've all heard before, and then repeated what I said while mocking my stutter. I could see my friend physically recoil from him. Her face clearing, showing a "did you really just act that way" expression. At the time, I just brushed it off. It bothered me for about 2 seconds in the moment. But even years later I still haven't forgotten. Still, I could tell with that one little moment of ashlery, my friend was not gonna go on a second date with him. I've shared this story before. But I once had two very young, like 15 at most, teenage boys come into my place for what was clearly their first date together. If not their first date ever. Maybe 20 minutes into their date one of their mothers showed up. Realized it was a boy her son was on a date with. And started screaming and crying about she didn't understand how he could do this to her and didn't he know she wanted grandchildren. etc. etc. Just flipped out and was totally homophobic and told him he wasn't allowed in her home if he was going to choose this lifestyle. He started crying. His poor date was totally bewildered. And ended up calling his mom to come take them home. Not a waiter but. Me and my GF sat next to an obvious first date at a Pan-Asian fusion restaurant, Zen in Durham, UK. She comments that her main course wasn't quite what she expected and thought it'd be spicier. He then snaps his fingers above his head very loudly so half the restaurant turns round to look and a waitress rolls her eyes and goes over. He demands that they cook it again and make it hotter. Next thing. There's half a dozen Thai waitresses around the table calling him worse than shit in Thai, my Thai GF translated. Causing a massive scene while her face turns red and they take her plate away. She then has to sit with no food while he continues eating. He eventually realizes he's ducked up and stops eating but she sarcastically tells him to enjoy his food. They brought her a fresh plate and they eat in silence. First and I'm sure the last date. Girl and guy came into the barbecue restaurant I worked at. They met at the door exchanging the usual hi. Nice to meet you. etc. The guy was a complete big dig. She ordered ribs and he said, do you want to keep that hot figure of yours or look like that chick over there? Points to slightly overweight woman then. When they were waiting to pay he starts flirting with the chick behind them. She deadass waited until he paid then left without waiting for the food. I'm a host at a restaurant but my first week working a gay couple got in a fight in the middle of their meal. Drawing attention from everyone in the restaurant. Before my manager could step in and stop it one stood up and shouted you're the reason most people are straight and left. I've always thought about how it is both a roast or compliment depending on sexuality. I served a table where the woman looked frightened and had a body language like she's leaning away from the guy while gathered tight. My co-workers would ask me if she's okay after they passed through my section. The guy was sitting and leaning over the table. Looked like he was invading her space. Angry looking guy. He talked to her like she was a dog that just pissed on the rug. When he went to the bathroom I asked if she's okay and she said yes. I doubt he got a second date though. I had a table I'm pretty sure was a married couple, in their 50s. Clearly together, etc. So call it a date anyways as they were out for dinner together. So it qualifies in a way. They both ordered draft beer. When I was bringing it out, I came to the table and the woman was screaming and crying uncontrollably. The man bending over her. I thought she was having a medical emergency. Turns out she got a call that a parent had died. The man turned to me and shoved a card at me. Asking to pay because they have to leave ASAP. And I said it's okay. They had not had anything. I was still holding the beers. And get this. I got a retoupe for doing this. As if I was going to make these people pay for 2 beers they never even sipped because a genuine emergency happened so that giant big corporation can add $12 to their $600 million. I had a tip top in a small booth and across from them was a family of 6. The tip top was in their mid 40s maybe 50. I was delivering food to the 6th top and I was being berated for not using legs with my big trays. So I grabbed a pair and headed off. When I was setting them down a stacked plate on my tray shifted to the side and the whole tray pitched toward the 6th top. I panicked and tried to stop it from falling and it all went backwards off the tray. Unluckily I didn't hear a single plate shatter. I turned around and the woman at the tip top had rib sauce on her face. Mashed potatoes in her bust. And broccoli all over her lap. I started with, I'm so sorry mom. Please stand up and we'll get you cleaned up. My 6th top was forgotten at that moment. I pleaded with her to get up so we could clean her off. Someone produced a towel for me. I had 2 managers trying to help. She was so polite and insistent that it was nobody's fault. Her husband finally said, At least wipe the sauce off your face." And she laughed and got up. Everything was comped on their ticket, including alcohol. It was the only tray I ever dropped, and they never made me use legs again. They came back in and asked for me the next week. The husband told me they were celebrating 30 years together that night. I felt horrible. Then he told me on their first date she made spaghetti and accidentally dumped it in his lap. He told her it was karma, and they had a huge laugh and a free meal. Girl was obviously super into guy, and he seemed like he was at least somewhat interested. They both talked and joked with me. Overall great table. Cut to the check. I ask if it will be together, and the girl smiles at the guy. He promptly says, "No. Separate please." Her face dropped, and he blatantly wrote his number on the check with a little note for me. That poor girl almost cried as she quietly shuffled out the door. What an ass he was. I was involved in the date, but the story is about my waiter. It's a first date from a plenty of fish lady who I had been chatting with. It's at a medium tier Italian restaurant in North Kansas City. I get there and my waiter is a shaved head. Huge muscular guy, very low key and professional. I get a glass of wine waiting for my date. I eventually get a second glass of wine. About 30 minutes into it and no text responses. I tell him I'll just order some food to go. Guy is a total professional. Doesn't let on anything about what is obviously happening to me. Finally he brings the back with the to-go order in it. Sets it on the table and leans in and says I put some extra biscuits in there. I tipped him well and left. I worked as a waitress in an Italian restaurant while in uni in 2006. Obvious first date comes in. He's booked it and requested a table in a secluded area of the restaurant because the acoustics would be perfect. She arrives and asks to move table to by the window. No big deal. He's annoyed at this. They ordered a carafe of the house red with their meals. Anything she said he'd turn it into some achievement he'd already accomplished. He kept making comments about her order, such as how fattening a dish would be etc, and then proceeded to say his family owned a vineyard and he knew a good red wine when he smelt one. He then asked for the most expensive wine on the menu and to take away the what he called piss of a house wine, then talked about how the bouquet was different and the clarity was so much better on the expensive wine. When it came to dessert she had enough of his sheet and flipped when he said that she shouldn't have any or she'd end up with stretch marks. She was a bit overweight but not overly so. She stood up and yelled at him for being a condescending piece of shit. For knowing duck all about wine, and dropped the coup de grace that her father was our wine supplier and that the house red was exactly the same as the most expensive wine, all of which was totally true. He was left speechless with the full check to pay. I had a guy come in who was supposed to meet his date there. He waited for a bit and I made sure to check on him quite often to make sure he was good. After about 30 minutes of him nervously waiting, he finally gave up and motioned me for the bill. He got a drink and a very small appetizer while waiting. I told him not to worry about and genuinely felt bad for him. I hope he's happy with someone now. Work at a bubble tea restaurant right near a college. It's a nice hangout spot with dim lighting, comfortable furniture, and board games. A lot of first dates happen here. Probably the worst I've ever seen was this guy that looked somewhere between 17 and 19 years old who met up with this girl around the same age. They got teas and took a seat at a table and played a board game and talked. His mother sat at the table next to him the entire time and just stared them down. It made me feel so bad for him. But the icing on the cake is when she goes up to them at 8:30 and tells them that it's time for the two of them, her and her son that is, to head home. The guy is visibly pissed but says goodbye to her and follows his mom out. Girl comes up to order another tea and I asked her about it. She was more than happy to fill me and the other girls in. This lady had essentially injected herself into the date, interrupting their conversation and critiquing her son's behavior. I know one of mine qualifies. We were both pretty passionate people about world events, and we both had our opinions. We met in a politics class and had a lot in common. So we came in all nervous and lovey, like you do. But it was pretty clear from the get-go we weren't going to work. And so I stood my ground as she stood hers. About 20 minutes in and the waitress asked us to please lower our voices as we were bothering some of the other guests. Neither of us had realized, but we were almost in a screaming match about whether or not the US should deploy armed forces to Darfur. She moved to England shortly thereafter. I'd like to believe I wasn't a contributing factor.